I'm talking to Tom Pelissero. Have about a minute left here. So the story, Tom, deserves more than a minute, but let's boil it down because that's the point of the question. When the average fan hears last night that the head of the union, the NFLPA, Lloyd Howell, resigns, and honestly, it's midsummer and they couldn't care less about conflicts of interest with private equity and all of that and collusion. Like the average fan is on summer vacation. And when you tell them, oh, my God, did you see this? They're like, all right, well, how does it affect me as the average fan? Or how does it affect the game that I love? My first reaction is, well, when you have negotiation on a longer season, which we all believe that is inevitable, there will be a new person in charge on the other side of the table. Beyond that, why should the average fan spend a lot of time thinking about Lloyd Howell?
Well, at this point, Lloyd Howell has removed himself from the situation, which is obviously an unfortunate ending that nobody expected when about roughly 2 years ago he was named to that post to succeed DeMaurice Smith, who had been close to 2 decades in the executive director post. There are parallels here, Andrew, and this is probably as close as I'll ever get to mentioning politics here or anywhere else, but there are parallels that I see to Elon Musk and the Department of Government Efficiency. When Lloyd Howell was hired, it was because of his business acumen, and this is based upon quotes from executive committee members, J.C. Treader at the time. They wanted him. They thought that they had an overly bloated business. There were obviously a ton of long-term employees. They thought that they could be more streamlined. They thought they could be more efficient. And so there were dozens, some of them long-time NFL Players Association employees who suddenly were no longer employed by the union. Well, what happens when dozens of longtime employees are no longer working someplace? There might be one or two of them that might not be happy with that, and suddenly you begin to have blowback that rightly or wrongly and in leaks and other things that are directed at the person who ultimately was in charge. And that person just decides to say, you know what, I don't need this. I'm going to do something else. That is a story, Andrew, that I think for anybody who has followed the federal government over the last 6 months can understand some of the parallels to that here. I would say why people should care is because sometime in the next 5 years, and I would say sooner than later, there are going to be negotiations on a new collective bargaining agreement. It potentially quite likely will include a negotiation over going to an 18-game regular season schedule. It will include the possibility of ripping up the various broadcasting deals, extending them, continuing to rethink them at a time that they've become more fragmented, obviously, to different streaming services and things. And ultimately, you're hoping, if you're a football fan, that there's no disruption. And who the NFLPA names to that post is going to have a heavy hand in exactly what direction things go. Lloyd Howell, again, came from a business background. He was a businessman. He was not a former trial lawyer, a federal prosecutor like DeMaurice Smith, who was, again, you can argue this either way, rightly or wrongly, but he did not mind confrontation. He was not afraid to fire back when you would see quotes. You didn't see that from Lloyd Howell. He felt the best way was do deals. And he did a lot of small deals, side deals and things to try to improve various aspects of the CBA while also having an eye to potentially opening up that agreement sooner than later. In the short term, the Board of Representatives at some point, possibly as soon as today, is going to meet. They're going to have to take steps to name an interim executive director, which there's no clause in the CBA or the NFLPA Constitution for what happens if the executive director steps down. There are a few logical candidates, people who are or have been with the union. Tom DePasso, who's been the longtime he's done a lot of things on the salary cap side, the legal side. He would be a potential option, but he was one of those people who was cycling out. It was not going to be with the union after the end of this year. Don Davis is another one who's been on the player affairs side. And then George Atala, who up until a few months ago was the assistant executive director of external affairs, I think was his title. He was essentially the number two in many ways in command to DeMaurice Smith. He left the NFLPA. He's one of the few people outside of D. Smith who know all the ins and outs of it. I could see any of those three people being potential candidates to allow the executive committee, however they decide to run this process, to run a thorough, quite possibly more transparent process than they ran with Lloyd Howell, to find the right person to set them up. Because as much as 5 years, Andrew, is a lifetime here,
Yep.
in terms of how many seasons and how many of the guys that are even in the league now are going to be in the league by 2030. But for a football fan, if you're thinking 5 years out, that is not a long way to avoid work stoppages, ugliness, you want to know that the train is going to keep moving forward here. And so the person hired is going to be very, very important. But for the next 6 months, Andrew, I would imagine, yes, the attention for most people watching the show certainly is going to turn to the action on the field.
Catch the Rich Eisen Show live weekdays from 12 to 3 p.m. Eastern on Roku Sports Channel in the U.S.